A knee
Clean it
struck
up,
the
my boy.
with a sickening thud. The ambient hum of the Iron Grid MMA Academy in Southside Chicago vanished into thin air. Jaxson Croft, the undisputed 25-0 champion, was kneeling on the floor with his right hand frantically slapping the canvas. His lungs pulled in desperate gasps. The man pinning him down wore a faded industrial-grade janitor's uniform. He had a gaunt frame, sharp cheekbones, and pale blue eyes that registered absolutely zero emotion. He leaned in close, his breath steady, and whispered a single sentence into the champion's ear. 312,000 people were watching the live feed. The relentless waterfall of comments abruptly stopped. 3 hours earlier, this exact same man had been on his knees in the center of that cage, scrubbing sweat and blood off the vinyl. He had been quietly cleaning this facility, night after night, for 2 entire years. Nobody ever bothered to ask why a man with his specific set of skills chose to push a mop in this exact gym. By the end of this night, every single person in the room would understand the terrifying truth. He was not there by accident. The digital clock above the heavy bag station read 9:41 p.m. Declan Hayes dragged his yellow mop bucket through the chain-link door of the main sparring cage. His movements possessed an eerie, mechanical efficiency that didn't match the job description. He grabbed a loose nylon strap on a 100-pound heavy bag and secured it with a specialized military-grade tension knot. The entire adjustment took exactly 3 seconds. His knuckles were heavily calloused, the cartilage permanently flattened from years of unprotected impact. He kept his head down. He pulled a pair of cheap, wired earbuds over his ears, drowning out the gym noise with an old, scratchy acoustic blues track. Toby, a 19-year-old amateur fighter who worked the front desk to pay for his gym time, was picking up discarded towels near the bleachers. He was the only person in the building who ever bothered to look Declan in the eye. Toby was struggling to wrap his hands, the cotton fabric twisting awkwardly around his wrists. Declan set his mop down and walked over. He didn't say a word. He took the wrap from Toby's hands, unwound the mess, and tightly bound the fabric over the boy's knuckles with rapid, surgical precision. Toby watched in silent awe. Declan gave the boy's taped fist a gentle tap, then walked away. Across the room, an old cutman named Pops Callahan was wiping down the medical table. Pops had spent 40 years stitching up fighters in dimly lit arenas across the Midwest. He squinted through his thick glasses, his gaze locking onto the long, jagged scar barely visible above the collar of Declan's shirt. Pops rubbed his chin, his mind turning over a very old, very dark memory. He knew he had seen those hands before. The heavy steel doors of the gym swung open with a violent crash. Jaxson Croft walked in like he held the deed to the property. He was flanked by a 5-man entourage, 2 of them holding up high-end cameras to stream directly to his 3.2 million followers. Jaxson wore a custom silk track jacket and limited edition Vanguard sneakers. He marched straight toward the main cage, dragging mud from the Chicago streets directly across the damp floor Declan had just finished cleaning. Jaxson didn't even look down. He casually kicked a half-full water bottle, sending it skidding into the side of Declan's boot. "Clean it up, mop boy," Jaxson said, flashing a highly rehearsed smile directly into the camera lens. Declan looked down at the puddle of water. He stared at the mud tracks ruining his work. His right hand tightened around the aluminum handle of the mop. The knuckles turned a stark, bone white under the harsh fluorescent lights. For a fraction of a second, the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then, he slowly relaxed his grip. He grabbed his rag and knelt down to wipe the floor. A few moments later, Marcus Thorne walked through the doors. Marcus was a high-stakes promoter, a man who wore an imported Italian suit to cover up the absolute ruthlessness of his business practices. He wore a heavy gold watch and carried a leather briefcase. As Marcus approached the cage to greet Jaxson, Declan froze. He was mid-wipe, a damp rag pressed flat against the mat. He didn't look up, but his pale blue eyes tracked Marcus's expensive leather shoes as they walked past. Declan's chest stopped rising. He didn't breathe for a full 12 seconds. The cameras didn't catch the look in the janitor's eyes. But if anyone had been paying close attention, they would have seen the quiet, terrifying realization settling over the room. The ghost had finally found his mark. 8 years ago, the freezing winters of industrial Detroit did not forgive hesitation. The air inside the abandoned automotive warehouses on the east side tasted permanently of rust, stale beer, and copper. Declan Hayes was a ghost in that brutal underground ecosystem. He was a bare-knuckle fighter who operated with the cold, detached precision of a surgical instrument. He had returned from a highly classified deployment with the Marine Raiders in the Kunar province carrying a permanently shattered sleep cycle. His mind was a chaotic storm of tactical variables and phantom gunfire. The unsanctioned underground ring was his only functional anchor. It was the only environment where the deafening noise inside his head could be translated into a physical, solvable geometry. He fought entirely in the dark, dismantling heavier opponents without a single shred of malice. His younger brother, Elias, was constructed from entirely different materials. Elias was 21 years old, possessed a reckless, blinding optimism, and played a battered acoustic guitar with a natural, effortless grace. More dangerously, he was completely obsessed with the violent mythology surrounding his older brother. Declan spent his quiet afternoons meticulously teaching Elias how to properly wrap his hands with athletic tape, strictly for self-defense. He constantly preached the gospel of physical restraint, drilling into the boy that violence was always a catastrophic failure of the human mind. Elias would nod, strumming soft chords on his guitar, but his eyes always drifted toward the heavy stacks of crumpled $100 bills changing hands in the warehouse corners. He wanted to help pay the rent. He wanted to be just like his brother. Marcus Thorne controlled the illicit betting books in the greater Detroit metropolitan area. Thorne was a corporate parasite dressed in imported Italian cashmere, a man who actively built his multi-million-dollar portfolio on the desperation of broken men. During a routine scouting visit, Thorne noticed Elias hovering near the edges of the blood-stained canvas. He saw the kid's raw, unpolished athleticism. More importantly, he saw a highly profitable, entirely disposable asset. On a freezing Tuesday night in late November, while Declan was working a grueling 14-hour night shift at a local steel mill, Thorne made his move. He manipulated Elias into stepping into a makeshift ring against a 240-pound drifter, promising a payout of $4,000. There were no paramedics on standby. There was no referee to recognize the vacant terrifies in the young boy's eyes after the second heavy blow to the temple. Declan never heard the final punch land. He only received a frantic, breathless phone call at exactly 11:47 p.m. The heavy static on the cheap cellular line entirely failed to mask the panicked, screaming crowd in the background. Elias hit the concrete floor, and his brain simply stopped functioning. Thorne immediately packed up the betting pool, shoved $84,250 in illicit wagers into a black leather duffel bag, and vanished into the freezing Midwest night, before the police sirens even approached the warehouse district. Declan did not scream. He did not break the furniture in their cramped apartment. He simply packed a single olive-drab duffel bag, left his brother's acoustic guitar leaning silently against the cast-iron radiator, and began a meticulously slow, agonizingly patient hunt. He followed the quiet whispers of Thorne's rapidly expanding sports promotion empire. He tracked fraudulent shell corporations, bribed athletic commissions, and phantom fight licenses from Michigan all the way down to Illinois. He traded his tactical combat boots for the faded, unremarkable gray uniform of a sanitation worker. He needed to be entirely invisible. He needed to wait for the exact perfect moment when the arrogant promoter felt entirely untouchable. The digital clock in the present day Chicago gym shifted to 10:14 p.m. The heavy, rhythmic breathing of Jaxson Croft echoed loudly through the expansive training facility. Jaxson had just dismantled his third sparring partner of the evening. The heavy-set heavyweight was currently pressing a plastic ice pack against a fractured jaw by the water cooler, spitting blood into a trash can. Jaxson paced the center of the cage like a predator, desperately craving actual, breathing prey. The adrenaline was a toxic, demanding chemical in his bloodstream, requiring immediate and public validation. He stared through the chain-link fence, his eyes landing on the lean, silent figure, pushing the yellow mop bucket near the bleachers. Jaxson sneered, violently adjusting the Velcro straps on his custom leather training gloves. He shouted at the janitor to fetch him a clean towel, his voice dripping with absolute, unearned authority. Declan continued sweeping the wet mop in slow, rhythmic figure eights across the vinyl floor. The complete lack of response felt like a physical, burning slap to the champion's fragile ego. Jaxson shoved the heavy cage door open. He marched onto the gymnasium floor with his chest puffed out, ensuring the 3 million people watching the live stream had a clear view of his dominance. He grabbed a heavy rubber medicine ball from the steel rack and hurled it directly at the plastic mop bucket. The heavy sphere missed the bucket by 3 inches. It slammed heavily into the shoulder of Toby, the teenage desk clerk, who was carrying a tall stack of freshly folded white towels. Toby stumbled backward, his sneakers squeaking sharply on the damp floorboards. The boy's head clipped the unforgiving steel support beam of the cage frame. With a hollow crack, the stack of towels scattered violently across the dirty ground. Toby slumped down against the metal grate, holding the back of his head, his face entirely drained of color. The entire gym went completely dead. The rhythmic slapping of the leather jump ropes stopped instantly. The low, mechanical hum of the overhead ventilation system suddenly sounded deafening in the frozen silence. Declan froze mid-motion. The sight of the pale, disoriented kid slumped against the cold metal structure completely bypassed all the logical, restrained centers of his brain. It was a visceral, chemical flash of a freezing concrete floor in Detroit. The aluminum mop handle slipped from his grasp. It clattered loudly against the floorboards. He slowly unbuttoned the top of his faded gray work shirt. He let the garment drop to the floor, revealing a torso entirely stripped of excess weight, wrapped tightly in dense corded muscle. A thick raised burn scar ran violently across his left rib cage. He walked slowly over to the equipment rack. He pulled a pair of standard 16-ounce training gloves from the mesh bin. He slid them onto his heavily calloused hands with an automated, terrifying familiarity. He stepped up onto the training mat. He looked directly at Jaxson, his pale blue eyes reflecting a chilling, oceanic calm. A very faint, ghost-like smile touched the corners of his mouth for the first time in 2 years. "We can move," Declan said, his voice dropping to a barely audible rasp, "but only if you promise not to cry." The harsh laugh of Jaxson Croft echoed through the silent space of the iron grid gym. It was a piercing sound, deliberately designed to flex his dominance to the 312,400 people watching through the camera lens. He clenched his fists, the veins on his neck bulging in shades of blue and gray. With a hyped-up growl, the undefeated champion lunged forward. He threw his signature looping right hand, the exact strike that had stolen the consciousness of 14 professional fighters in the very first round. The centrifugal force tore through the air, creating a violent whistling sound. But that leather-wrapped fist only struck empty space. Declan Hayes was simply no longer standing in that spot. He did not jump back or execute any flashy, evasive maneuvers. The janitor simply lowered his center of gravity slightly and tilted his body axis to the left by exactly 3 centimeters, just enough for the wind from the punch to graze the shoulder of his shirt. He borrowed the champion's own frantic momentum to throw him off balance, sending him staggering forward 2 more steps. Jaxson cursed. He pivoted, gritting his teeth, and unleashed a rapid 6-strike combination: jab, cross hook, and a low kick aimed straight at the knee. Not a single strike landed. The entire gym felt like it was witnessing an optical illusion. Declan moved with absolute geometric precision. He wasted zero energy jumping or launching counterattacks. His feet glided lightly across the sweat-soaked vinyl mat, maintaining an exact millimeter distance from his opponent's damage range. His gaunt face showed absolutely no emotion, no anger, no excitement, only a chilling, terrifying focus. His pale blue eyes were not looking at Jackson's gloves, but staring directly at the hollow of the champion's throat, reading every muscle movement before it even had the chance to generate force. He was punching a ghost. Outside the steel cage, Pops Callahan dropped a roll of white medical tape to the floor. The old man's wrinkled hands shook violently as they gripped the plastic-coated steel mesh. His chest heaved. With 40 years of experience standing in blood-soaked corners, the old man realized that what he was witnessing was not standard combat sports technique. It was the flawless nullification of movement. It was the survival skill of men who walked out of slaughterhouses. "That is Tier 1 evasion," the old man whispered, his voice catching in his dry throat. "That man is an absolute ghost." After a minute and 20 seconds of throwing frantic strikes into thin air, Jaxson began to gasp. His lungs burned from oxygen deprivation. Beads of sweat poured down, running along his temples and stinging his eyes, which were now bloodshot with humiliation. The invisible pressure of hundreds of thousands of people, glued to the live stream, was crushing his arrogant nervous system. He could not even touch a garbage man. He let out a desperate roar, abandoning all basic defense, and threw his entire 190-pound body weight into a wild uppercut. Declan did not step back anymore. He gently slipped his shoulder into the opponent's blind spot. Time seemed to freeze for a millisecond. His 16-ounce gloved hand slowly rose, reached past the champion's sloppy guard, and gave a light tap squarely on Jackson's sweat-drenched forehead. The sound of leather meeting flesh was very quiet, but it hit like a thunderbolt straight into the fighter's ego. "I can touch you whenever I want," Declan said, his voice deep, as still as a frozen lake. The champion's face went from deep purple to dead white. This public humiliation completely destroyed any remnants of his professionalism. Jaxson lost his mind. He lunged like a wild animal backed into a corner, his boot heels slipping hard on the wet mat as he stumbled dangerously toward the edge of the cage. Right there, pressed against the steel mesh, young Toby was sitting on the ground, holding the swelling on the back of his neck, still dazed. Jackson's massive arm swung blindly, nearly smashing directly into the teenager's face. The screech of grinding metal pierced Declan's eardrums. The image of the boy grimacing in pain instantly overlaid the memory of the exact moment his younger brother Elias collapsed on the cold, concrete floor in Detroit 8 years ago. A dry click echoed in Declan's cerebral cortex. The switch was flipped. The steel bolt that had caged the violent monster in his mind for the past 8 years finally shattered. The temperature around him suddenly dropped 10 degrees. Declan closed the angle. The physical distance between him and the champion was erased in less than a tenth of a second. He used his forearm, rigid as a rod of cold steel, to deflect Jackson's desperate punch aside. Instantly, he slid tight against the opponent's chest and locked his right arm around his neck. He hooked his right leg behind the champion's knee, shattering the physical center of gravity of a body moving at high speed. Gravity did the rest. The massive block of muscle crashed down onto the vinyl mat. The impact echoed like an ancient tree being chopped down. Jaxson Croft, the undefeated king of the modern octagon, was now flattened against the floor, trapped in a rear naked choke with zero chance of escape. Declan pressed tight against his back, his left arm locking down the right bicep, creating a flawless mechanical vise, compressing directly on both carotid arteries. Absolute panic began to invade the champion's dilating pupils. The sudden cutoff of oxygen caused his peripheral vision to narrow into a dark tunnel. His face turned purple. His legs kicked wildly against the steel fence in a desperate, futile struggle. He felt the terrifying mechanical strength of the arm strangling him, a strength that possessed absolutely no hesitation, as cold and ruthless as a descending guillotine. The nightmare set in. He realized that this man was completely capable and entirely willing to snap his neck right here, in front of the entire world. Jaxson Croft's right hand flew up, slapping frantically and desperately against the vinyl mat. He surrendered. He begged for his life. At the exact millisecond, the sound of the hand striking the mat echoed. Every muscle in Declan's body suddenly relaxed. He unhooked the lock, pulled his arm back, and stood up with a terrifying stillness. His breathing remained perfectly steady, his chest hair rising and falling, only slightly. He shook off the gloves, letting them fall freely to the floor. Declan looked down at his own calloused hands. No blood was spilled. Toby was safe. The enemy was subdued. He closed his pale blue eyes for a single second, absorbing the truth he had desperately craved for 8 long years. He did not squeeze for a single second longer than necessary. He was not the monster he had always feared. The fight was over, but the true reckoning was only just beginning. Pops Callahan pushed his heavily calloused hands against the reinforced steel cage door, the metal hinges letting out a sharp, agonizing squeal that echoed through the entirely silent gymnasium. His heavy leather boots dragged across the vinyl mat, leaving wet streaks behind him. The old cutman's voice shook violently, vibrating with a mixture of absolute awe and deeply rooted terror as he stared at the gaunt janitor standing motionless over the broken champion. I know exactly who you are. You ran the Detroit Underground Circuit 8 years ago. You were a ghost even back then. Everyone in the tri-state area thought you were buried under a concrete slab. Declan Hayes did not acknowledge the old man's words. He did not blink. His pale blue eyes completely bypassed the gasping, humiliated champion, still struggling to pull oxygen into his crushed windpipe on the floor. Instead, Declan's gaze locked directly onto the expensive imported Italian suit standing just outside the primary camera frame. Marcus Thorne was gripping the handle of his bespoke leather briefcase so intensely that the blood had completely drained from his knuckles, leaving them a stark, bone-white hue. The wealthy promoter felt a sudden violent drop in his core body temperature. The luxurious fabric of his suit suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket. He recognized those icy, dead eyes immediately. He recognized the terrifying phantom he had recklessly created in a freezing, blood-stained warehouse in Detroit exactly 8 years and 4 months ago. Declan stepped out of the octagon. His heavy work boots left deliberate, wet footprints on the gray concrete floor, each step sounding like a hammer striking an anvil in the dead silence of the room. He reached into the deep front pocket of his discarded gray work shirt. His flattened, calloused fingers pulled out a thick, tightly bound manila envelope. He did not throw it. He walked over and deliberately dropped it onto the stainless steel medical table, directly in front of the primary live stream camera rig. The heavy slap of the paper against the metal sounded like a gunshot. The thick stack of documents spilled out under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. It was an autopsy of a billion-dollar empire. There were highly classified offshore bank routing numbers, specifically detailing the transfer of $84,250 to a phantom shell company named Apex Holdings LLC. There were official, heavily stamped medical examiner reports from an unsanctioned warehouse fight in Wayne County, Michigan, explicitly citing blunt force trauma and gross criminal negligence. There were the physical, unredacted copies of encrypted emails showing Thorne aggressively paying off local precinct captains with untraceable crypto transfers to intentionally lose the physical evidence of a young 21-year-old boy's death. Declan had not spent 2 agonizing years quietly sweeping floors and scrubbing toilets just to punch an arrogant fighter in the face. That would have been a catastrophic failure of the mind. He had spent 2 entire years patiently, methodically accessing Thorne's unprotected internal office servers every single night between 2 and 4 in the morning, while the building was entirely empty. He had been quietly, surgically dismantling the man's entire life from the inside out. Declan turned and stared directly into the main camera lens. The live digital counter in the corner of the monitor rapidly ticked upward, spiking to exactly 412,803 concurrent viewers. The chat box on the side of the screen was moving so incredibly fast, it was nothing but a chaotic blur of white text. Marcus Thorne builds his multi-million-dollar champions by burying desperate kids in the dark, Declan said. His voice was entirely flat, completely devoid of any theatrical emotion or Hollywood anger. It was the voice of a man reading a weather report. Look at the paper trail. Look at the coward hiding behind the suit. Thorne began to aggressively stammer, his jaw working frantically but producing absolutely no coherent sound. He instinctively backed away toward the red, glowing emergency exit sign, his trembling fingers finally losing their grip. The $3,000 leather briefcase dropped heavily onto the floor, bursting open and scattering meaningless promotional contracts across the dirty tiles. His meticulously crafted empire of wealth, elite status, and corporate intimidation was violently dissolving in real time. It was being broadcasted globally to every athletic commission, federal tax investigator, and aggressive sports journalist in the country. He tried to loudly claim the documents were completely forged. He frantically cited standard operational procedures, liability waivers, and his expensive legal team, but his vocal cords tightened and his voice cracked and failed entirely. The live chat feed was already pulling the federal tax ID numbers from the broadcasted documents, aggressively cross-referencing them in real time on public databases. The flashing red and blue lights of 3 Chicago police cruisers were already reflecting intensely through the gym's high frosted glass windows. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. The digital execution was absolute. Jaxson Croft, still coughing up thick strings of saliva on the mat, slowly looked up at his wealthy promoter. The glamorous, bulletproof illusion of his entire professional career shattered into a million irreversible pieces. The arrogant champion slowly pulled himself up to his knees, utterly refusing to look at the streaming cameras. He was completely broken by the horrific, paralyzing reality of the man who legally owned his exclusive fighting contract. Jaxson realized in that exact moment that he was not a king. He had been nothing but a highly paid, utterly disposable pawn built on the blood of a dead kid. Declan leaned down, quietly picking up his faded gray shirt from the floor. He slowly pushed his arms through the sleeves, the rough fabric covering the thick burn scar on his ribs. He walked slowly back to the center of the mat, leaning over the exact spot where Jaxson had been pinned, and begging for his life. Just a few moments before, Declan finally finished the sentence he had whispered during the terrifying chokehold, his voice carrying the immense, crushing weight of an 8-year funeral. Someone should have known exactly when to stop. He whispered softly into the quiet room, making the champion heard every single syllable. Today, I stopped. You have to live with it. 6 months later, the atmospheric pressure inside the Iron Grid Academy had completely transformed. The heavy bags were entirely replaced with brand new, high-density foam gear. The floors were properly sanitized, smelling faintly of pine cleaner rather than stale sweat and copper. The large front window facing the Chicago street bore a newly painted, bright white sign reading the Elias Hayes Foundation. It was now a completely free youth athletic clinic, operating entirely on anonymous local donations and community grants. Declan stood quietly by the edge of the sparring mat, wearing a clean, simple black athletic shirt. His posture was relaxed, his pale blue eyes finally holding a fraction of warmth. Toby, fully recovered from his concussion and standing with perfect disciplined military posture, was carefully wrapping his own hands with pristine white athletic tape. Declan watched the teenager, nodding slowly in silent, profound approval. The absolute first lesson we learn in this specific room, Declan told the small, attentive group of neighborhood kids sitting cross-legged on the mat. His voice carried a quiet, immense gravity that commanded total respect without ever needing to raise its volume. He knelt down, looking the youngest kid directly in the eyes. The most important strike you will ever throw in your entire life is the one you know exactly when to pull back. Strength is not about what you can destroy. It is about what you choose to protect. In the far dimly lit corner of the gymnasium, leaning quietly in the shadows against the reinforced steel cage, the old yellow mop bucket remained perfectly in place. Declan had specifically requested to keep it there. It was a silent, permanent, and terrifying reminder to anyone who walked through those doors. The most dangerous, capable person in the entire room is rarely the one making the most noise. It is usually the one quietly, patiently cleaning up the mess. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of quiet power, deep psychological resilience, and absolute undeniable justice. If you want to see what actually happens when loud arrogance blindly meets the immovable object of truth, hit the bell icon right now. You never know who is sweeping the floors in your own life.